What if the language you grew up speaking literally changes the physical way your ears hear a sound? And I mean, not metaphorically and not culturally,
Right.
biologically.
Right, like physically altering the hardware.
Exactly. Like, what if the grammar of your mother tongue physically rewires the baseline algorithms your auditory cortex uses to just, process a simple non-linguistic tone in an empty room?
It is, honestly, it's a staggering concept.
Mm.
Because we tend to think of language as this overlay, right?
Yeah.
Like a software program we run on top of our standard human hardware. But the reality of the neurobiology suggests that, well, the software actually dictates the shape of the hardware.
And that is exactly where we're going today. So welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, and I am joined, as always, by our resident neurobiology expert to unpack all of this.
Hey there. Yeah, I am so excited for this one.
Me too. For those of you listening who just love to sit with a truly disruptive idea, who want to understand the actual mechanisms behind, how we think, how we speak, and how the modern world is actively altering that machinery, we have a fascinating stack of sources to go through today.
We really do. It's basically a cross-century collision of ideas.
Right. On one end, we have Walter Pillsbury and Clarence Meader's 1928 foundational psychology textbook, The Psychology of Language.
Which is wild, by the way. A text written decades before anyone had ever even conceived of, like, a functional MRI machine or an EEG.
Yeah. It's almost spooky how predictive it was. And then on the other end of the stack, we have these cutting-edge 2026 neurobiology papers. One is detailing the mechanics of predictive coding in the brain, and another is exploring neuroplasticity, the visual diet, and how digital environments interact with our cognitive architecture.
Yeah, the mission today is to trace the whole life cycle of a thought, from the exact millisecond and intention forms in your mind, to the physical spoken word, and then all the way to how spending, 4 hours a day scrolling through short-form video algorithms is structurally altering that exact biological sequence.
It's going to get intense. But I want to start with that 1928 text, because honestly, I am incredibly skeptical of how a book nearly a century old maps onto modern brain scans. I mean, before we can talk about digital algorithms breaking our brains, we need to establish how a thought actually becomes a sentence in the first place, right?
Right.
So what were Pillsbury and Meader reacting against back in their era?
Well, they were pushing back against a very rigid, hyper-rationalist view of human thought.
Yeah.
The prevailing dogma of the 19th and early 20th centuries, championed heavily by scholars like Max Mueller, essentially argued that thought and language were fundamentally indistinguishable.
Wait, indistinguishable? Like they were the exact same thing?
Yeah, exactly. Miller basically posited that it was impossible to even hold the concept of an object in your mind without immediately having the corresponding word attached to it.
So under that model, if I don't have the word for, say, frustration, I can't actually experience or conceptualize frustration.
According to the strict Mullerian view, yes, exactly. The assumption was that rational conceptions existed in the mind, fully formed, articulated in this silent internal monologue, and that speaking was just the mechanical process of reading that internal script out loud.
But that doesn't track with how I actually experience speaking at all. Half the time, I start a sentence without having any idea how it's going to end.
Oh, absolutely.
I just kind of trust that I'll land the plane,
Yeah, and that lived experience is exactly what Pillsbury codified. He introduced this concept he called preliminary intention. He argued really forcefully that before we begin speaking, there is no fully formed sentence waiting in our cognitive queue.
No script to read from.
Right, no script. Instead, there's this vague, almost imageless foreshadowing. It is a feeling of purpose, a general direction of thought, rather than a sequence of nouns and verbs.
Okay, let me push back on imageless foreshadowing, because that sounds, honestly, a bit mystical.
It does, yeah.
How can I have an intention to communicate a really complex point if I don't have any images or words in my head yet? What actually is the intention?
It's an effective state, combined with a general target. Think about the physical sensation of wanting to point at something before your arm actually moves.
Okay, yeah, I can picture that.
Pillsbury argued that the intention is an anticipatory tension. That a certain notion needs to be expressed, but the explicit detail, what hasn't been rendered yet, the words themselves are not the thought. The words are just the automatic physical fulfillment of that anticipatory tension.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the feeling is the intention, and the words are just the automatic exhaust of that feeling. Is this kind of like when you want to make a point in an argument and you have the vibe or the melody of the point, but your mouth just automatically fills in the lyrics based on your past vocabulary habits?
That is a perfect analogy, yeah. The vibe is the preliminary intention. Pillsbury explained this through what he called mental context and associative meaning. He argued against the idea that words have static dictionary definitions in our brains.
Right, because a dictionary is just too rigid.
Exactly. Instead, a word is a trigger for an organized cluster of past experiences. Meaning isn't inherent to the syllables, it's the fringe of past associations.
The fringe, I like that.
Yeah, so when you need to express your preliminary intention, your brain relies on habituated associative pathways. The intention sets the trajectory, and your past experiences automatically supply the vocabulary that has historically satisfied that exact state of tension.
Wait, but if my mouth is just running this automatic associative program based on a vague feeling, why don't I just spout absolute gibberish?
What do you mean?
Like, if I have a vague feeling of hunger and my past associations with hunger include apples, restaurants, and my grandmother's kitchen, why do I say I'd like a sandwich instead of just yelling, apple grandma restaurant?
That's a great question. And it's because of a mechanism Pillsbury termed the subconscious sensor. And this is honestly one of his most prescient ideas. He theorized that there is a background cognitive process constantly monitoring the automatic output of your speech pathways.
Like an internal editor?
Yes, but a subconscious one. The sensor evaluates the words you are automatically generating against your original, vague, preliminary intention. And the evidence for this, as Pillsbury pointed out, is found in our speech errors.
Oh, like when we misspeak?
Right.
Hmm.
Think about how you realize you've misspoken. Do you plan to make a mistake? Consciously realize it's a mistake and then say it out loud anyway?
No, definitely not. I usually say the wrong word, hear myself say it, and then immediately stop and correct myself. Like, I left my keys in the wait, no, on the counter.
Exactly that dynamic. You didn't consciously plan the word fridge. Your automatic associative pathways misfired because fridge and counter might be tightly linked in your mental context of a kitchen.
Oh, I see.
But the moment the word fridge was generated, your subconscious sensor threw a red flag because the associative fringe of fridge sharply conflicted with your underlying preliminary intention of locating your keys.
So the sequence is a vague feeling of intention, then automatic associative generation of words, and then a rapid-fire internal sensor checking the physical words against the vague feeling to make sure they match.
That's the exact loop.
That is a brilliant model for 1928. I mean, truly.
Yeah.
But you said earlier that this maps onto modern neurobiology. When we put someone in an fMRI machine today, we obviously don't use terms like imageless foreshadowing or subconscious sensor.
No, definitely not.
What is the modern mechanical equivalent of this process?
The modern framework that validates all of this is called predictive coding. And it requires a pretty fundamental shift in how we view the central nervous system. Modern cognitive neuroscience posits that the brain is not a passive receptor of information.
Okay, so it's not just sitting there waiting.
Right, it does not wait for sensory data to arrive at the eyes or ears, process that data, and then figure out what's happening. Instead, the brain operates as a Bayesian Inference Machine.
Okay, Bayesian inference. I hear that thrown around a lot in statistics and tech, but let's ground it in biology for the listener. What does it actually mean for a wet, squishy organ to perform Bayesian inference?
Bayesian inference, at its core, is just a mathematical method for updating the probability of a hypothesis as more evidence becomes available.
Like constantly adjusting your bets.
Exactly. In biological terms, it means your brain is an engine of continuous prediction. Based on your lifetime of past experiences, your mental context, to use Pillsbury's term, your brain constantly generates an internal generative model of the world.
Oh, wow.
And it uses this model to predict the sensory inputs it is about to receive, literally milliseconds before they actually hit your retinas or your eardrums.
Wait, hold on. So my brain is actively hallucinating what the room looks like, what your voice sounds like right now, before the light and sound actually reach me.
It is an educated hallucination, yes. Your brain constructs a prior, which is an expectation. When the actual sensory data arrive from the outside world, the brain just compares its hallucinated prediction against the raw data.
But why go through all that trouble? Why not just process the raw data as it comes in? Because generating a constant hallucination sounds incredibly exhausting.
It's actually the exact opposite. It is a survival strategy driven by a biological imperative called free energy minimization. The brain is a super metabolically expensive organ, right? It consumes roughly 20% of your body's energy, despite being only 2% of its weight.
Right, it's an energy hog.
Huge energy hog. Processing raw, novel sensory data from scratch every single second would require a catastrophic amount of metabolic energy.
So it actually takes less energy to guess what's going to happen than to actually perceive what's happening.
Yes, provided the guess is correct. If the incoming sensory data matches the brain's top-down prediction, the sensory data is effectively explained away. The neural activation in your sensory cortices actually drops.
It drops. It literally turns down the volume.
Exactly. The brain suppresses the redundant information because it doesn't need to waste metabolic resources processing something it already knew was going to happen. It's a really incredibly efficient compression algorithm.
Okay, I follow the efficiency argument, but I have a major problem with this model.
Okay, what is it?
If my brain is constantly suppressing data that matches its past experiences, and my perception of the world is just an educated hallucination based on what I already know, how do I ever notice anything new? Like, how do I learn?
You learn through failure. You learn through what neuroscientists call prediction errors.
Prediction errors.
Yeah. When the actual sensory data does not match your brain's internal model, a literal biological error signal is generated. This is the physiological equivalent of Pillsbury's subconscious sensor throwing a red flag.
The red flag.
Exactly. The unpredicted sensory data cannot be explained away, so it propagates back up the cortical hierarchy, forcing the higher cognitive regions to update their internal model.
So the mistake forces an update. That is fascinating. But can we actually see these prediction errors happening in the brain? Or is this just another really elegant theory?
Oh no, we can measure them with extraordinary precision using electrophysiology. The sources highlight two specific neurophysiological markers. The first is the mismatched negativity, or MMN.
Mismatched negativity. Okay.
Right. If you are listening to a predictable sequence of sounds and suddenly an unexpected pitch or rhythm occurs, electrodes on your scalp will record a sharp spike in negative electrical activity, peaking exactly 150 to 250 milliseconds after the aberrant sound.
150 milliseconds. That is way below the threshold of conscious thought.
Entirely subconscious. That MMN spike is your auditory cortex literally screaming, "Prediction failed. Update the model."
Wow.
And the second marker is even more relevant to language. It's called the N400. This is a negative voltage spike that occurs around 400 milliseconds after a semantic violation.
Give me an example of a semantic violation, like a grammar mistake.
More like a context mistake. If you are reading a sentence that says, "He spread the warm bread with butter and," your brain's predictive engine has already pre-activated the semantic networks for words like jam, honey, or jelly.
Right, because it's minimizing free energy by guessing the next word.
Exactly. But if the sentence actually ends with, "He spread the warm bread with butter and socks," your brain detects a massive contextual clash. The word socks cannot be explained away by the prior model, generating a massive N400 prediction error.
So Pillsbury's sensor-checking automatic words against an intention is actually the brain generating N400 prediction errors when linguistic output doesn't match the associative model. That connects so perfectly.
It really does.
But, okay, earlier I teased a fact in the intro about language changing how we hear non-linguistic sounds. And the sources detail a specific study comparing Basque and Spanish speakers. Walk us through the methodology here, because this honestly blew my mind, and it perfectly illustrates predictive coding in the wild.
Oh, this is a landmark piece of research. It totally shifts language from just a communication tool to a fundamental perceptual filter. The researchers wanted to know if the syntactic structure of a person's native language actually alters their low-level auditory predictions.
Okay.
So they looked at two groups, native Spanish speakers and native Basque speakers.
Why those two languages specifically? Are they super different structurally?
Yes, because of how they construct phrases. Spanish is what linguists call a functor initial language. The short function words, like articles or prepositions, usually come before the longer content words, like nouns.
Okay, give me an example.
Think el pájaro, which means the bird. Short word, then long word. So the rhythmic chunking of Spanish leans heavily toward a short, long pattern.
Got it. Short, long, short, long.
Basque is the exact opposite. It is a functor final language. The grammatical markers and postpositions are tacked onto the ends of the longer content words. So its rhythmic prosody naturally defaults to a long, short pattern.
Okay, so you have these brains that are habituated to two completely inverted rhythmic structures based purely on their native grammar. What was the experiment?
They placed participants from both groups into an EEG machine, but they didn't play them words. They played entirely non-linguistic, abstract, binary rhythmic tones, just basic auditory beeps in a room. Short beep, long beep, short beep, long beep.
Wait, so there is no language involved at all at this point in the experiment, just raw physical sound.
Exactly. Raw acoustics. Then the researchers started randomly omitting tones to trigger prediction errors. And here is the astonishing result. When a long tone was omitted from the sequence, the Basque speakers' brains generated a massive mismatched negativity spike. Their auditory cortices registered a severe prediction error.
What about the Spanish speakers?
Their brains barely reacted. Conversely, when a short tone was omitted, the Spanish speakers generated huge error spikes, while the Basque speakers showed a much weaker response.
That is incredible. Let's make sure the gravity of this really lands for you listening. You are saying that because a Spanish speaker grew up with grammar that places short words before long words, their auditory cortex literally expects the physical universe to supply short sounds before long sounds.
Yes.
And when a random beep in a lab violates that grammatical rule, their brain generates a biological error signal.
You have understood it perfectly. The syntax of their mother tongue became the Bayesian prior for their perception of physical acoustics. We are quite literally hearing the world through the neurobiological filter of our grammar.
Okay, mind blown. So the brain is an incredibly powerful prediction engine. It hallucinates expectations based on past experience to save metabolic energy. But this raises a massive chicken and egg question.
Oh, for sure.
Where does the brain get the raw data to build those structural expectations in the first place? If predictive coding is the software running the hallucination, how does the hardware actually get built? The sources point to something called the visual diet.
That is the crucial pivot here. The brain is not born with a fully loaded dictionary of Bayesian priors. The generative models have to be built, refined, and physically wired into the cortical architecture over time. The mechanism that allows for this physical wiring is neuroplasticity specifically, experience-dependent plasticity.
Neuroplasticity, that is one of those terms that gets thrown around in self-help seminars a lot, like rewire your brain for success, let's get under the hood. When a baby is taking in visual information, looking around a room, how does a photon hitting the eye actually result in a physical change in brain tissue?
Well, it comes down to the strengthening and weakening of synapses, which are the connections between neurons. When you encounter a novel visual stimulus, the neural circuits that process that specific pattern fire together. As the psychologist Donald Hebb famously postulated, neurons that fire together wire together.
Right, Hebbian learning.
Exactly.
Wow.
Repeated exposure to the same visual pattern causes chemical and structural changes at the synapse, increasing the efficiency of neurotransmitter release. The connection becomes stronger, faster, and more dominant.
So if I stare at a coffee mug every day, the coffee mug neural pathway gets wider and faster, like upgrading a dirt road to a multi-lane highway.
That's a great way to picture it.
But wait, if every time I learn something new or see something repeatedly, my synapses get stronger, wouldn't my brain eventually just overload? If you only ever widen the highways, eventually you run out of land, right?
That is an incredibly astute observation, and honestly, it was a major puzzle in neuroscience for decades. If long-term potentiation, which is the strengthening of synapses, happened unchecked, the neural network would become hyperexcitable. You would suffer from runaway synaptic strengthening, leading to systemic instability and essentially neurological chaos.
Which sounds bad.
Very bad. The brain requires a compensatory mechanism.
A way to tear up old roads to make room for the new ones?
Exactly. And the sources detail this remarkable cellular mechanism that governs this, the ARC protein. The ARC protein enforces a strict metabolic budget. It operates on a principle of heterosynaptic depression.
I'm going to need you to translate heterosynaptic depression into English for us.
Fair enough. Think of it as a highly localized balancing act. When one specific synapse is strengthened to encode a new piece of data from your visual diet, the ARC protein is synthesized. This protein physically travels to neighboring inactive synapses within a very strict microscopic boundary, specifically a 50 micrometer radius.
Okay, 50 micrometers, that's tiny.
Extremely tiny. And once there, it triggers the removal of AMPA receptors from the surfaces of those neighboring synapses.
Wait, it physically removes the receptors, so it actively unplugs the neighboring connections.
Yes, exactly. By removing those receptors, it weakens the surrounding synapses. The ARC protein dictates that if one connection within a 50 micrometer radius gets louder, the surrounding connections must be forced to quiet down to maintain the overall energy baseline of that local network.
That level of microscopic precision is just hard to fathom. It's not just a vague shifting of energy. It is a zero-sum game at the cellular level. If I learn a new visual pattern, I am actively biologically suppressing other local connections to pay for it.
It is a ruthless metabolic economy,
Right.
and this is exactly why the concept of the visual diet is so critical. The daily sequences, patterns, and contexts of the visual stimuli you consume are the raw materials driving this continuous structural remodeling of your brain. Every visual input is forcing the ARC protein to strengthen some pathways and dismantle others.
How does this constant visual remodeling relate back to language, though? We established that language predicts the physical world. But how does looking at things teach us to speak? The sources bring up a study involving preschoolers, novel objects, and kitchens.
Right, this illustrates the concept of visual linguistic mapping, because language acquisition is fundamentally a mapping problem. How does a child learn that the auditory sound, cup, corresponds to the physical object in their hand? The visual context, the actual background environment, acts as the crucial scaffolding for this massing. We don't learn words in a vacuum.
Right, a child doesn't learn the word apple in an empty white room. They learn it while sitting in a specific high chair, in a specific kitchen, with a specific lighting setup.
Precisely. The brain encodes the physical object and the background scene simultaneously as part of the exact same associative network. In the study highlighted by the sources, researchers taught preschoolers made-up words for entirely new, abstract objects. Half of the objects were presented to the children against a visual background of a kitchen. The other half were presented against a visual background of a playground.
So they are linking a fake noun to a specific visual environment.
Yes. Then came the testing phase. The researchers completely removed the visual backgrounds. The child was looking at a blank screen. The researchers then played an audio sentence containing a verb that was strongly associated with one of those contexts. For example, they would play a sentence using the verb eat, which implies a kitchen context, or play, which implies a playground context.
And what did the children do?
The researchers were using eye tracking software, and the millisecond the child heard the action verb eat, their eyes immediately darted toward the novel object that had previously been mapped to the kitchen scene.
Even though the kitchen wasn't there. The verb triggered the invisible visual background in their memory, which then triggered the expectation of the noun.
Exactly. The stored representation of their visual diet allowed the child's predictive engine to make complex online semantic predictions. This highlights a critical distinction the sources make between how the brain processes nouns versus verbs.
Nouns seem easy, right? A cup is a cup. What makes verbs so different?
Nouns are highly stable, concrete visual entities. The mapping between the word cup and the physical geometry of a cup is very direct. But verbs are relational and transient. The physical manifestation of an action is fleeting and highly variable.
Like the verb to bring. Bringing a glass of water looks very different visually from bringing a lawsuit or bringing a dog to the park.
Exactly. Because the visual properties of verbs are so inconsistent, the brain requires high contextual diversity to map them. You need to see the action performed across many different visual environments for the brain's neuroplastic mechanisms to extract the core relational meaning of the verb. Verbs require a much richer, more diverse visual diet to neurologically cement than nouns do.
This brings up an inevitable question, and it's one the sources address with some truly astonishing data. If our language centers require a visual diet to structurally wire themselves, what happens to the language centers of people who are congenitally blind?
Right.
Like people who are born with zero visual diet. Does their predictive engine just fail to build?
The data on congenitally blind individuals provides arguably the most profound demonstration of neuroplasticity we have. In a sighted individual, the primary visual cortex, known as V1, which sits at the very back of the brain in the occipital lobe, is highly specialized. It is a modality-specific region devoted entirely to processing visual sensory input.
It is the biological hardware for sight.
Correct. But in an individual blind from birth, no visual data ever arrives at V1. You might assume that this highly specialized visual hardware would simply atrophy or just sit dormant, but the brain is far too metabolically efficient for that. It hates vacant real estate. In the absence of visual input, the structural pathways of V1 are seamlessly colonized by higher cognitive functions.
Colonized by what?
By language.
Hey, seriously?
Yes. When neuroscientists put congenitally blind individuals into fMRI machines and ask them to generate verbs or process complex semantic meanings, their primary visual cortex lights up with massive neural activity.
Let me pause to make sure I am grasping the magnitude of this. The physical region of the brain that evolved over millions of years to process light and shadow is instead calculating the grammatical relationship between words.
Yes. The underlying neurophysiological architecture of the occipital cortex is completely co-opted to process the semantic relationships of language. This proves that the anatomical destiny of the brain is not rigidly pre-programmed by genetics. Cortical regions are colonized by whatever sensory and cognitive demands are most dominant in the environment.
Okay, this is the terrifying pivot point of this entire deep dive.
Here we go.
If the brain's physical architecture is a zero-sum game dictated by the ARC protein, and if cortical real estate is actively colonized by whatever visual and sensory inputs dominate our environment, what happens when we drastically alter the environment? What happens when our primary visual diet shifts from a diverse three-dimensional physical world to a relentless stream of algorithmic short-form video on a two-dimensional screen?
That is the defining neurobiological crisis of our era, because the brain will adapt. It must adapt to minimize prediction errors. But adaptation is not always beneficial. Sometimes adaptation is a degradation of the hardware.
Let's get into the hard data here. What is a synthetic digital visual diet physically doing to the brain?
The neuroimaging data comparing heavy consumers of digital media to lighter consumers reveals significant structural alterations. One of the most critical findings concerns the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, or the ACC. In individuals who engage in chronic heavy media multitasking, rapidly switching between multiple apps, streams, and screens, MRI scans show a statistically significant reduction in gray matter density in the ACC.
Gray matter reduction means actual brain cells are dying off or shrinking.
It indicates an atrophy of the neuronal cell bodies and synapses in that specific region.
And what does the ACC do? Why should I care if it shrinks?
You should care deeply, because the ACC is the crucial node for top-down cognitive control. It's the executive manager of your attention. It is responsible for sustained focus, emotional regulation, and most importantly, interference management, the ability to ignore a distraction and stay on task.
So the physical brain tissue required to pay attention to a difficult, unrewarding task is literally eroding in people who constantly multitask with digital media.
Yes. The environment is training the brain that sustained attention is no longer metabolically necessary, because the stimuli change every 3 seconds anyway. The brain ruthlessly prunes the ACC to save energy. We see a similar neurological signature when we look specifically at short-form videos, or SFVs. Think TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts.
The endless scroll.
The endless scroll. Heavy consumption of SFVs is strongly correlated with a drastic drop in theta power in the frontal cortex during executive control tasks.
Theta power. Let's define the mechanics of that.
Brainwaves are rhythmic electrical impulses. Theta waves are relatively slow oscillations that are heavily implicated in deep focus, working memory, and the active manipulation of complex information. When you are reading a dense book and holding multiple characters and plot lines in your head, your frontal cortex is generating high theta power.
So a drop in theta power means what, mechanically?
It means the brain is losing its electrical capacity to hold and manipulate complex thoughts over time. The structural neuroplasticity induced by SFVs is adapting the brain to expect brief, hyperstimulating bursts of novelty. It is optimizing for rapid context switching. Consequently, the capacity for deep reading, prolonged problem solving, and sustained cognitive effort begins to atrophy.
This feels like a biological trap. If the brain's ultimate goal is to minimize free energy and save metabolic resources, then an algorithm designed to serve us perfectly predictable, bite-sized novelties is essentially hacking our deepest biological mandate.
You have hit on the exact mechanism of the digital hijack, the basal ganglia habit loop, driven by dopamine. And we need to clarify a massive public misconception here. Dopamine is colloquially referred to as the pleasure chemical. People think you scroll social media because dopamine makes you feel good.
Right. Everyone talks about chasing the dopamine hit.
It's a flawed framing. In the context of habit formation and behavioral reinforcement, dopamine doesn't primarily reward pleasure. It rewards predictability and the resolution of uncertainty.
Wait, if it rewards predictability, why am I scrolling? I don't know what the next video is going to be.
You don't know the specific content of the video, but the structure of the reward is hyper-predictable. The habit loop operates on 3 components: the cue, the routine, and the reward. The cue is the brightly colored app icon. The routine is the physical swipe of your thumb. The reward is the microdose of novelty. Your brain learns that this sequence has a 100% success rate in resolving the microtension of boredom.
So the dopamine reinforces the reliability of the system.
Exactly. And because this closed loop is so reliably predictable, the brain shifts the cognitive load. Making conscious decisions requires the prefrontal cortex, which is metabolically expensive. Running an automated habit requires the basal ganglia, which is metabolically cheap. As the digital habit loop solidifies, your prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline.
Let's connect this all the way back to 1928. Pillsbury said that human action and speech were driven by a conscious, internally generated preliminary intention. But you are saying that when I pull out my phone in an elevator, I am not acting on an intention.
Precisely. You are acting on a basal ganglia habit loop triggered by an external environmental cue. The algorithm is designed to bypass your preliminary intention entirely. It subverts the prefrontal cortex, exploiting your brain's evolutionary desire to conserve metabolic energy by automating behavior. You aren't choosing to consume the visual diet. Your brain is automatically executing a low-energy routine.
And what happens when that automated routine is constantly feeding me content that isn't just mindless, but actively anxiety-inducing? Because the algorithms don't just optimize for cuteness, they optimize for engagement, which usually means outrage, tribalism, or danger. The sources call this cultivation theory.
Cultivation theory was originally pioneered in the late 1960s to study the long-term effects of television viewing. The core premise is that chronic exposure to media gradually cultivates a viewer's fundamental perception of reality. It replaces their physical, lived truth with a synthetic, media-generated worldview.
So how does that map onto modern predictive coding algorithms in the brain?
Well, if your brain is a Bayesian Inference Machine, it builds its generative models based on the statistical distribution of its inputs. If your algorithmic visual diet disproportionately feeds you videos of crime, social collapse, or hyperpolarized conflict, because those trigger the highest engagement metrics, your brain must treat that data as valid training material.
So my brain's predictive engine starts updating its priors. It starts hallucinating that the real physical world is exactly as dangerous as my TikTok feed.
Yes, this leads to a documented psychological phenomenon known as the mean world syndrome. Heavy consumers of algorithmically curated threat content neuroplastically adapt to perceive their physical communities as vastly more dangerous, hostile, and untrustworthy than empirical crime statistics dictate.
And I want to pause here and make something explicitly clear to you listening. We are not talking about left-wing media or right-wing media here. The sources we are analyzing are entirely politically agnostic. They are analyzing the underlying neurological mechanisms. The algorithms that drive engagement are politically blind. They only see attention. Whether your specific feed is cultivating outrage against a particular political party, a social movement, or an entire generation, the structural result is identical. Your brain is biologically adapting to expect a state of persistent environmental threat. It is a biological survival mechanism being hijacked by commercial engagement metrics.
Beautifully stated. The brain is simply doing its job, minimizing prediction errors. If the synthetic visual diet screams that the world is hostile, the neural networks physically rewire to anticipate hostility.
Okay, so we have digital environments shrinking our attention hardware, automating our behaviors away from conscious intention, and cultivating a paranoid perception of physical reality. But the sources suggest the deepest damage isn't just to our attention or our anxiety levels. The deepest damage is to the structure of human empathy and the diversity of our thought. Let's move into the final pillar of this deep dive: mirror neurons, AI, and epistemic collapse. What exactly is a mirror neuron?
Mirror neurons are a fascinating class of specialized cells discovered in the 1990s. They have a dual firing mechanism. They fire when you physically execute a specific motor action, like reaching out to grab a cup of coffee.
Huh.
But crucially, these exact same neurons also fire when you sit perfectly still and watch someone else reach out to grab a cup of coffee.
So my brain physically simulates the action I am observing.
Yes, they are the neurobiological substrate for social learning, imitation, and cognitive empathy. They allow you to run a subconscious, low-resolution internal simulation of another human being's physical and emotional state. When you see someone slam their finger in a door, you wince because your mirror neuron network is partially simulating their pain.
So how does social media interact with this system? At first glance, exposing my mirror neurons to millions of different people around the world seems like it would create a golden age of global empathy.
It creates the illusion of empathy through a phenomenon researchers call narrative transportation. This is a state of deep cognitive absorption in a story or a video where your emotional centers are highly activated, but your critical analytical brain regions are functionally bypassed. Social media is a massive, relentless trigger for mirror neuron activation. But there is a fatal structural flaw in the medium itself.
What's the flaw?
It's an incomplete simulation. Evolutionary biology designed mirror neurons to operate in a rich, three-dimensional, multisensory environment. When you observe someone in physical proximity, your brain is processing microexpressions, peripheral cues, pheromones, spatial dynamics. But on a two-dimensional screen, heavily edited, cropped, and stripped of peripheral context, the mirror neuron firing sequence is often truncated.
Wait, it fires, but it doesn't resolve.
Precisely. You get the initial emotional arousal, the outrage, the sudden burst of sympathy, but the neural networks required for deep cognitive resolution, perspective-taking, and nuanced emotional comprehension are starved of the necessary sensory data to complete the simulation.
It's like revving a car engine in neutral. You get all the noise, the heat, the burning of fuel, but the transmission never engages. You don't actually move anywhere or connect with the road, you just burn out the engine.
That is a highly accurate mechanical analogy. This constant incomplete triggering leads to an erosion of genuine cognitive empathy. We are left with a volatile hive mind that is highly reactive emotionally, but structurally malnourished when it comes to deep, sustained empathetic reasoning.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most insidious element in our source stack. We have an emotionally reactive, cognitively malnourished populace communicating primarily through digital text. And into this ecosystem, we drop large language models. AI. Millions of people are now using AI to write their emails, compose their essays, and structure their thoughts. Now, my initial skepticism here is, aren't LLMs just a tool? I use a calculator to do long division because it's faster. I use an LLM to write a memo because it's faster. Why is offloading syntax to a machine any more dangerous than offloading math to a machine?
Because of how an LLM actually functions and what language actually is, you must look under the hood of the AI. Large language models are not thinking machines. They do not possess a preliminary intention. They are autoregressive statistical engines.
Autoregressive meaning what exactly?
Meaning they operate on next token prediction. Based on the sequence of words provided in the prompt, they calculate the statistical probability of what the next most likely word should be, based on their massive training data set. And they are optimized for a specific mathematical metric called perplexity.
Perplexity. What does that mean in the context of AI?
In information theory, perplexity is a measurement of how surprised a predictive model is by a piece of data. An LLM is engineered to minimize perplexity. It wants to be as unsurprised as possible. To achieve this, it outputs the highest probability average of its training data. By definition, to minimize perplexity, the AI must strip away cognitive outliers. It must sand down unique syntactical quirks, idiosyncratic phrasing, and unusual conceptual linkages. It generates the most statistically average, frictionless language possible.
Okay, so AI writing is a bit sterile and boring, I'll admit that. But if I just use it to write a corporate email, why does that really matter?
Because we have spent this entire hour establishing that language is not merely a tool for communication. From Pillsbury's intention to modern predictive coding, language is the neurological scaffolding we use to perceive reality. The syntax you use physically wires the Bayesian priors in your brain.
Oh, wow.
Yes. The sources detail a recent EEG study comparing two groups of humans. One group was tasked with writing essays manually, formulating their own thoughts. The other group was tasked with writing essays using an AI assistant to generate the text.
And the neural activity.
The individuals using the AI exhibited the lowest levels of neural engagement across the cortex of any group tested. It induces a state of profound cognitive laziness. But the neurological inactivity is only a symptom of the deeper threat, which researchers call epistemic collapse.
Epistemic meaning relating to knowledge itself, the collapse of how we know what we know.
Think about the biological feedback loops we've discussed. Your brain learns by constantly adjusting its internal models based on its diet. If human beings continually outsource their language generation to an autoregressive model that is mathematically designed to minimize perplexity, and if language scaffolds our perception of reality, what happens to human thought?
If I am constantly reading and accepting the AI's statistical average of language, my brain's predictive engine is going to update my internal models to match that average. Through neuroplasticity, I will physically wire my brain to think more like the AI.
Exactly. Through the mechanics of experience-dependent plasticity, you induce maladaptive neuroplasticity in your own cortex. You begin to subtly align your communication styles, your framing of complex issues, and eventually your moral and philosophical opinions with a statistical algorithm designed to avoid outliers.
We standardize human thought.
We lose the cognitive diversity that drives human evolution. The idiosyncratic, weird, unique, associative fringe that Pillsbury identified in 1928, the very friction that creates new ideas, is mathematically smoothed out. The machine doesn't become more human, the human becomes more like the machine.
So bringing this all together, we started with Walter Pillsbury and Clarence Meader nearly a century ago. They propose the beautiful idea that language is the complex fulfillment of a uniquely human preliminary intention. It is a vague internal drive that relies on a rich, highly personal mental context to find the words to express itself.
And we traced how modern neuroscience completely validates that model. Your brain is a massive prediction engine. It literally wires itself down to the microscopic 50 micrometer radius of an ARC protein based on the unique visual and linguistic diet you feed it.
But the environment has changed. We are now subjecting this ancient, metabolically driven prediction engine to a synthetic, heavily constrained visual diet. We are scrolling through algorithms that shrink our attention hardware. We are trapped in habit loops that bypass our conscious intention. We are cultivating a baseline perception of fear. And now we are utilizing AI to homogenize our very language into a sterile statistical average.
We are systematically replacing uniquely human intention with automated prediction error minimization. We are allowing the algorithms to colonize the cortical real estate.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. And as always, we don't want to just leave you with the data. We want to leave you with a provocation, something to observe in your own life that builds on everything we've unpacked today. Tomorrow morning when you wake up, when you open your laptop to compose an email, or when you are about to speak a thought out loud over coffee after scrolling through your feed, I want you to pause for one single second.
Ask yourself, who is actually authoring your words?
Is the sentence you are about to type born from your own uniquely forged preliminary intention? Is it drawing on the rich, weird, idiosyncratic associative fringe of your own life? Or is your brain simply minimizing a metabolic prediction error by repeating the algorithmic average of the synthetic visual diet you consume today? The architecture of your brain is a zero-sum game, and it is entirely up to you to decide what kind of world your brain is going to predict next.